Okay. Well, good morning. Uh-oh. What's that warning sign, Heidi? This is scary. You all don't see the warning sign. There's a warning sign on that side. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Hard to live with it, hard to live without it, so to speak. But it's better if I can just look up there instead of being stuck in my notes. Okay, well, where we in our class last week, we've been looking at and seeing play out this differences in how things are looked at, and we see that kind of representative kind of in somewhat in the Nashville area, the Tennessee area. We see this a little more, a little kinder, a little gentler approach to thing. And then out of Texas, we see this hard charging, tear it down, and going after people, kind of a technique. And eventually that Texas style way kind of won over probably the majority of kind of the way things were looked at, and so we see this happening and playing out in the publication. We're talking about two publications. We're going to get to the second one today of the Christian Leader, and where they're trying to. There's a group that's trying to change that hard charging, tear it down approach to things, and so we're seeing that play out in the life of the central congregation that is in Nashville as kind of a representative of things, and so that's what we have. That's what we have going on. So we see this battle, and so there's those that are saying that those that are preaching this kinder or gentler approach are soft and so on and so forth. And so in their open letter included affidavits from other preachers who had little appreciation for the emphasis of, I think it's E.W. McMillan, who's a preacher at the Central Congregation and was one of the guys that was starting the Christian Leader or helping support that publication. Gus Nichols of Alabama was a case in point. Frankly, I think he's too soft to preach the gospel. And I was surprised that the Union Avenue Church in Memphis would use a man whose record was questionable. They had gone over to the drifters and the softies, and if one wants wisdom in abundance and pretty words and lectures, etc., then he is all right. But for a gospel preacher, I frankly consider him a failure. And so we see this playing out. And so McMillan, because all this incoming flack, others encouraged him, thought it best if he transferred out of the Central Congregation. It was feeding the hungry, taking care of the homeless, and so on and so forth, which really wasn't done a lot as far as expressed in that way. In a larger way among our fellowship, there was more of staying true to do you believe the right things, if you will? And so this was a change and a clash that was going on. And so McMillan transferred over to the Union Avenue Church in Memphis, which is a huge congregation. And I think G.C. Brewer, preached there later on. I think that's who it was. And so anyhow, so we see this playing out. And so what does it mean to preach the gospel? Well, this brother from Alabama is looking at it, because McMillan's not preaching that tear it down, name names, so on and so forth, that he thinks that's not preaching the gospel. And so it's, again, just illustrating this different worldview, not worldviews exactly, but just these different understandings. With no sense of history whatsoever, the sponsors of the open letter called instead of this softy gospel being preached, that the ancient Jerusalem gospel preached by the Campbells, Stone, John T. Johnson, Raccoon John Smith, Harding, E.G. Sewell, and Lipscomb. In other words, in their assumptions that somehow the things that they preached was all this different. And it's very interesting, and one of the reasons why it's important that we study and look at things is that we have assumptions about things that may or may not be correct, or I should say accurate. In things, and we may think it's more of this or more of that, and we may find out something different. So they're equating that somehow this gospel they're preaching, or actually it's a way of preaching, is different from some of our founding fathers, if you will. The leader's experiment in positive constructive journalism came crashing down in 1940. Remember, it only lasted 2 years. In the spring of that year, Clinton Davidson, who was the brother that had the money, that was basically making it happen, delivered 2 speeches at Abilene Christian College. And Sewell considered these speeches favorable to premillennialism. And remember, that's the rage going on. That's the stuff. And he felt betrayed. He wrote to Davidson, "Since hearing your 2 speeches at Abilene, I can go no further with the Christian leader." And to McMillan he wrote, "I heard those speeches and I'm through." Sewell expressed hope that Pepperdine Foundation of Los Angeles might take over the leader. So, again, what do we have happening here? We have a group of brothers that said, you know what, we need a different style of journalism. And so we're gonna support this. And so Clinton Davidson, who had the money, remember his insurance and all that kind of stuff up east, he bought an existing paper and then was going to put this content, subscriber list, and so on. Well, remember, the problem that they had was the subscribers that read the old Christian leader were not those that were highly supportive of this way of looking at things, and that's really the reason the leader failed, whereas 20th century Christian, as we'll see in a few minutes, didn't fail and lasted a long time. We're all familiar with that. And so what happened is the accusations about this gentler style, they're saying, is really to hide the premillennial thoughts. And we've talked extensively about, what that was, and apocalypticism, and some of the overlap, and some of the things that it wasn't the same at all. And so that's what we see playing out. And so as we see these, we see there's always this broad spectrum. And so people might support some of this, but they don't that, and some will go this way, and that's usually the way it is. So they're coming together to try to do something a little different, and yet these other issues are causing issues. And so Sewell said, hey, let's get Pepperdine. And of course, we've all heard of Pepperdine College University. He was the founder of Western Auto Supply. And so he had a lot of money. And so that's how Pepperdine University got started with his. So what do? You got to go to the guy that can support this. And so that's what's happening here. In 1937, George Pepperdine, founder of Western Auto, had already established Pepperdine College. and institution related, obviously, to our Churches of Christ and later Pepperdine University, and still there. But George Pepperdine's fortunes had declined since 1937, so he didn't have as much as he once had. And Macmillan reported in July of 1940 that income for the Pepperdine Foundation had been decreased by the war. So now, even though the United States was not officially in World War II, you know, there's things happening. And so somehow that's affecting his business, the amount of money he has, the amount of money he can put into his foundation, is what this is describing. And hence, a Christian leader will not go to the West Coast. He's saying, I can't do that and support it. And at least for the present, and it never did. So that idea fell through. Instead, G.H.P. Showalter, editor of the Firm Foundation of Austin, Texas, announced in December 1940 that he had acquired the ownership of the Leader and would assume sole responsibility for its contents. Well, Showalter was not one that was probably very supportive of what was being written in the Christian Leader. And so since it's not making any money, Davidson sells it, he takes it over, and lets it just go, basically. And so that kind of ended it in Foye Wallace's view. The Davidson Leader movement is dead, and he was right, at least for the moment. But the new Christian Leader had pioneered a new kind of journalism. It was out there. And a kind of theology, if you will, that would increasingly characterize certain segments of our Churches of Christ for the remainder of the 20th century. The new journalism and associated theology would move Churches of Christ further away from that exclusive sectarian mentality of the 19th century and would increasingly celebrate the values of basically the conservative Protestant culture of the United States. And so we see this change going on, of which we're on this side of this. And as we look at some of these things, well, what's the big deal about, this or that or whatever? Well, we're on this side of that. And so just trying to understand it. In this way, the Christian Leader initiated a transition fundamentally similar to the one that Alexander Campbell had made in 1837, if you recall, when he was elected to defend Protestantism. Remember, he met in Cincinnati, and they were with other groups and so on and so forth, and they had asked Campbell to defend Protestantism against Catholicism, is basically what it was, and we covered that fairly extensively. And so that was a change that went on. Well, one difference was that while Campbell acknowledged this change that he was dealing with, those directing the Leader apparently possessed little or no awareness of this dimension of their work. And the naivete in this regard was closely connected to their continued commitment to the primitive Christian faith. In other words, and we're going to see this play out more, the idea of saying we're first century Christians, that plea that we always had of looking back, and then this acceptance of the things of modernism, they just weren't going to go well, and yet tried to hold on to that. And then the thing is, though, while the underpinnings of the foundation of thought that helped give the vitality to what we call our primitivist call, looking back to the first century, that the apocalypticism, that remember that idea of God is that's who we follow, and all the things that we've talked about involved with that those underpinnings were slowly eroding. Pacifism and all those things that energize that understanding were changing. And so it's trying to have the idea and the concept, but the foundation that supported all that was going to be changing. Since the days of Campbell and Stone, the notion of primitive Christianity had become central to the thinking of Churches of Christ. And we would say still is. We understand that plea. And so the foundational to orthodoxy in every aspect of our tradition, that no one who cared about his or her standing in the church could afford to waffle on the theme, much less abandon it outright. So in other words, that's a foundational thing of who we've been as a fellowship, is that plea of let's go back to the New Testament. Let's restore the restoration. Let's restore what we understand as the things of the New Testament. And so that's foundational. And if someone was not supporting that, they were not going to be able to be up there and accepted for really long, because that was an important tenet. So just understanding what's going on. But put another way, primitive Christianity had become the defining foundational myth for our tradition. Now, when I use this word myth, okay, let's define that a little bit. You know, because we think a myth is something that's not true. We think of the Greeks and so on and so forth. Well, a myth in this context can also be using the idea of a foundational story. In other words, the beginnings, the looking at things, the things that people are pinning their understanding on. And so in a lot of scholarship now, they'll refer to those myths, of those stories that people accept as so, that may or may not, depending on whatever amount, whatever degree. And so we have a lot of foundational myths on the story of America. You know, one of the more famous ones, George Washington and the cherry tree. We've all heard of that. I cannot tell a lie. And yet you study what historians are telling, and those who have researched, they go, we don't think that ever happened. Yet we kind of hold that because it's holding up George Washington's character, who was our first president, and so on and so forth, and all that follows. And so anyhow, so there's these things that as people we believe and understand, and they may or may not be as factual as we think. Now, that doesn't mean we're believing something that's not true or lies or things like that, but it's just kind of what that is. And so primitive Christianity, this going for that is very important in our tradition. In this context, few of these progressives that were looking at things differently sensed any disjunction between the celebration of modern values and the commitment to the primitive Christian faith. On the other side of the fence, Foy Wallace and his people were fully convinced that the progressives had abandoned their historic sectarian posture. In other words, that we're interpreting things right and you're not, and that's what's most important. Okay, and so we see this happening. Ken, you got to say something. Well, and admittedly, this is complex. It's not simplistic, and it's not all this or all that, and as we've already seen on a lot of stuff. But what's happening is this acceptance of what we've talked about, and we'll further clarify these modern values. This change is happening as we're into the, coming from the 19th into the 20th century is very real. And so the problem is to hold on to what was viewed as the primitive Christianity, and how you get there and do that was changing and wasn't the same as it had been in the 19th century, that understanding. And so there were those that tried to say, hey, well, wait a minute, just because we're embracing modern values doesn't mean we're not looking at it that way. But in reality, it's kind of hard to have kind of embraced both, at least in the way that it had been. And that was going to cause some conflict and change. Because remember, anytime things change and become significantly different from the way people have understood them, that creates upheaval and anxiety, and it could be anything in life. Okay? So, does that help a little bit? This isn't simple, I admit. So, let's get on to the 20th century Christian publication, which most, if not all of us, have been familiar with, because in our lifetimes, this was one of the major publications that people read and had and influenced along with the firm foundation and, of course, others, but those were two of the biggies. And so, of all the literature in the Churches of Christ through this period, the 20th century Christian perhaps most graphically depicts the fusion of conservative 20th century Protestant values with a commitment to primitive Christianity. And so it's blending these things of modernism and the plea for primitive Christianity that we've held. Once again, these individuals who led the project had all enjoyed opportunities in higher education. So they came from the universities. Okay, they had been exposed to other things and thinking and so on and so forth than, those that are, out here not having those opportunities, working in the real world, all that kind of stuff we describe it as. 4 graduate students of Nashville's Peabody College, M. Norval Young, and I think he became the president of Pepperdine later, J.D. Bales, and he was a long time at Harding. Did you all have him as a teacher? Was he a teacher there? Did you have classes with him? One, okay. So he was a long-time fixture and preacher. George DeHoff and Woodrow Witten. And they conceived an idea for this journal in 1938, same time as the Christian Leader. Disillusioned with the fighting style that increasingly characterized journalism in our Churches of Christ, concerned that Churches of Christ had failed to communicate effectively with the younger generation, these students determined to bring a message of Churches of Christ more in line with contemporary concerns, a goal strikingly similar to that of the new Christian Leader. Further, these young men were also committed to positive, constructive journalism. So they're, in a sense, trying to do the same thing that the leaders were doing. So it kind of came from two different places, but a kind of a similar idea, wanting to address a problem. And why was part of that? Well, part of that was, this is really turning a lot of people off. This charging, ripping, fighting style isn't connecting to some. Some people it did, a lot of people it wasn't. There was concern of these issues that you're fighting over aren't near as important to our generation as it was to theirs. It sounds like it's been that way every sets of generations. We always think it's just ours because we're living in it. Yeah. Well, they probably aren't all 18-year-olds that they're calling that group. Well, but you're right. But the important thing is, and really important for us to realize, is that we all think that our generation, whatever that happens to be, and what makes sense to us, makes sense to those following. And it's not that it doesn't. But there's always questioning, just like our generation questioned the things of the previous generation. And it's always been that way. And so if we tell ourselves stories that it's never been that way, then we struggle. Mm-hmm. Sure. And who decides that? Well, and so I'm not in disagreement about what you're saying. Well, yeah, and we need to listen to one another and talk about these things because you know what? I was just listening to some podcasts. I delivered my artwork to the state fair yesterday, so that's a long drive, and so I get to listen to things. And so just it's talking about these very things that we need to listen and try to find out and ask rather than reject because it's not what I've held to, whatever it happens to be. Now, again, that doesn't mean that someone's going to have to or should change what they're thinking, but there's others out there that think differently and for the same reasons that we do. You know, they're studying their Bibles too, and yet they're coming at it from a different sets of things, experiences, so on and so forth. And so they have questions that were different than maybe our questions were. Sure. Yeah, all this discussion is not meant to say that, hey, you need to change the way you think on all this. That isn't the purpose of it. But rather the purpose is that are we open to talking to our brothers and sisters about things because some were saying, you know what, if you don't think this way, you're out. You shouldn't be here. Let's cancel. You know, we see in politics, cancel culture. If you don't say the right things, and it happens both sides. It's not all one way. And so some of us look at that, and I'm sure many of you, well, why are they doing that? Why are they going to that extreme? Because that's what happens. And those kind of things have happened, and not just our group. It's been happening to every group. And so if we're going to, how do we do better? Is that first of all is that we listen and talk instead of first or whatever. You had your hand raised, brother, didn't you? Or you were just waving at me? Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. 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 Well, and that's why you try to see and you understand. And there are some things that like I can never understand that. No, correct. And I'm not arguing for that or anything like that, but I'm just saying yes. Yeah. And so how do you do that? Well, it depends. Some would say they're loving them by kicking them out. Right? That you're being tough, that you're this or that. Gerald. Well, you mean that influences things? That it's okay where I can command that if it's their family, but all of a sudden it's mine. That changes it. Gerald, you were going to say something. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure they are. And so often the struggles have been over the millennium have been, how are we understanding that? Because in the Middle Ages, they understood it a lot different than they did in the 19th century, than today. And so we see that. People seeking God, people looking at the scriptures, yet coming to some, well, that's why we look to Christ. And it's not necessarily about doctrinal positions on every little thing and point and all that. It's about looking to Christ and striving to be as He is and live as He does. Well, we think, well, of course, but that's not easy, and that's, we often equate. We think, well, I'm loving Christ if I'm chewing them out because they don't do this or do that. And it's like, should that equating be going on? Maybe, and maybe not. And so I'm just saying it's complex, and so trying to get some awareness. And so so we see this playing out. So there's Norval Young on my left. I guess it'd be your left too. There's young J.D. Bales. George DeHoff, and you say, well, where's Woodrow Witten? I couldn't find a picture of him that I could tell. Who knows? And I couldn't even get the dates of it. So a name, and like so many other names, you just don't know. And the story is bigger than just these actors, because we're all part of the story too. Yet, who knows who we are? Well, maybe a few people, but we're not, in the mix like that. But anyhow, so Norval Young took this idea of 20th century Christian, the paper, to E.H. Ijems, who we've mentioned before, who is then president of Lipscomb College. But he received little or no encouragement. Ijems informed Young that the group of older men, that was Davidson and the others that formed the leader, were about to launch a significant journal backed by substantial funding that would accomplish precisely what these young men had in mind. And Ijems therefore advised Young and his colleagues to stand aside and entrust their common vision to an older generation. Okay, well, they didn't go along with that. And you know what? That's not necessarily bad. Because you got a different set of things and ideas, and it turns out that what they started lasted a long time, for decades and decades, whereas the other lasted 2 years. And so, you try to encourage things that are good. And so anyhow, that's what we see playing out here. So that was, I think, the first cover. I was able to find it. And I think it was probably black and white. Why? Because color costs a whole lot more. So despite this advice, the graduate students determined to press ahead with their own funds and resources, which probably were not substantial. And they issued the first number of the 20th Century Christian from the basement of Nashville's Hillsborough Church of Christ. I've driven by there. In October of 1938, only 3 months before the Christian leader appeared. So they actually got theirs out a little bit sooner. Knowing that none of them carried sufficient weight in the churches of Christ to serve as an editor. In other words, you got to be somebody knows, in those realms, get you some status. And so they secured the position of J.P. Sanders, who was a preacher at the Hillsborough Church. I was not familiar with that name. And Athens Clay Pulius, who is the vice president of David Lipscomb College, and we're going to run into his name a little bit later on in some things. And to serve along, and then Hugh Tyner, who is dean of Pepperdine, to serve along with Sanders and themselves on the editorial council. So they got like-minded men together, because that's what an editorial board is, or it could be women, and And so they got some name recognition in support of what they're doing. Far from being disillusioned with the core message of Churches of Christ, these students were deeply committed to our tradition of and heritage of the ideal of primitive, non-denominational Christianity. And they sought to make the traditional message relevant to their own time. And the cover of this periodical bore the motto, and that's, you can't see it, it's written in cursive under the title up there, New Testament Christianity in the Present Age. Okay, so that's what they came out with. Now, anybody seen that logo look familiar? What does it look like? In another realm. Correct. Well, you're saying what they published, but I'm saying, where did that logo? 20th Century Fox movie studios. Well, that was it. Now it's 21st Century Fox, I think. Yeah. Well, our inspiration for it as being something new and different, and so that's where they kind of got, the idea. It doesn't look exactly like it. Young and his cohorts found inspiration for the title in the 20th Century Christian in two sources. First, it played to the theme of first century Christianity and implicitly pointed backward in good primitive fashion to the first Christian age. Okay. Second, it celebrated the present and the modern. The Hollywood film studio 20th Century Fox helped to inspire the title. Obviously, movies were something modern, and so on. And so they just got the idea from it as standing. Turn of the century as a movie studio. Meaning the 19th century or 20th century. Yeah, it was one of the earlier movie studios, along with MGM later and some others, and and then. Yeah. So anyhow, but they see this in the screen and go, I'm trying to connect to our times, and so interesting. When the magazine changed its name to 21st Century Christian in January of 1990, and some of us remember when that happened, it dropped the motto, New Testament Christianity in the Present Age, but in 1996 they reinstated it. And why, I don't know. So just kind of interesting. And now, this isn't even published anymore. Or if it is, it's all digital. I'm not sure there's a paper. Yeah, digital. And so, so the things have changed, even from then. So just interesting. Despite their preoccupation with the modern world, these students maintain significant links to the Stone Lipscomb tradition. J.D. Bales and George DeHoff and Woodrow Witten all graduated from Harding, where they had been influenced by J. Ann Armstrong. And Norval Young had been deeply immersed in this tradition, having grown up in Middle Tennessee. His mother's father and uncle both owned farms adjacent to David Lipscomb. Because remember, where Lipscomb University is, that was Lipscomb's farm. And so his mother studied not only under Lipscomb, but also under Harding and T.B. Larimore. Young himself graduated from Lipscomb College. In later years, this is, Young looking back, he claimed no memory of either that hard-charging, fighting, legalistic, exclusive outlook in the churches of his youth in Middle Tennessee. Now, here you have a case of someone saying, you know what, those weren't my experiences. And probably so. It could be because he was unaware of them. And, when we're kids, we're usually not very aware of what's going on around us as much as we are later on. But but that doesn't mean it wasn't going on. It just wasn't in his. And he recalled a pietistic perspective centered on prayer, love, and one's relation to God through Christ. And so that spiritual aspect that we said that Barton Stone's, kind of wing was so focused on. And in the 1930s, all four of these students had embraced the pacifist tradition that had been central to the apocalyptic worldview. Now remember, down in Texas, they didn't necessarily think that way. And remember, they even had an ROTC training thing put on down at Abilene and so on and so forth. So we see these different things going on. The 20th century Christian was fundamentally shaped to the extent by these students who were rooted in the Stone Campbell tradition and their preoccupation in the modern world. These influences helped to make the journal a bridge between an apocalyptic outlook of the 19th century and the pragmatic perspectives of the 20th century. And that's the modernism and way of looking at things. On balance, the fascination of the founders with technological, scientific, and cultural progress eventually weakened and transformed the apocalyptic perspective to the extent that it finally bore little resemblance to the outlook of their forebears. And so there's major transition that's going on in the body, in the world, in the culture of how things are looked at. And yet they're still holding on to the primitive plea, if you will. But the underpinnings that held that up for so long are going away. Different reasons. Well, it is because they're not holding to the things that Stone did and the others did. And remember, that's referring to a looking back. That's not a negative. Well, looking back as that source, and it's no different than what your understanding of what that was when it's referred to. Well, but that's why we're talking about it. At least maybe we'll understand a little more. That's okay. We're working. To understand the nature of this change, we must recall that this apocalyptic perspective in the 19th century Stone Lipscomb tradition pointed in two directions. It looked backward to that the New Testament was a time of perfection, sort of, if you look at it that way. And that's what we're trying to emulate, and we understand that very much. And also looking forward to the last age when those perfections would triumph over the whole earth. Remember in Daniel, the rock that comes down and blows up all the things of man, if you will, and the governments. And so Lipscomb and others and Stone would say, what are you doing even bothering with that? Don't even vote, so on and so forth, because God is going to destroy it all. Focus on the things of the kingdom. Okay, and that... It can be, yes. Yeah. What he's saying is that what we believe and understand may or may not be exactly what the Scriptures say. But that's true of all of us as we try to understand things. And it's just very interesting. Thousands in this tradition, from Stone to Lipscomb and beyond, argued that God's eschatological end times kingdom stood in judgment on all of human culture. That's Daniel. R.H. Bull questioned whether all human culture was not perhaps illusionary when viewed from the standpoint of the infinite, which would revitalize all human creations and institutions in the last age. In other words, when Jesus came back, that's when things will all be made right, is basically what he's holding to that. The students who launched 20th Century Christian had come to age not in the old, blighted South of their parents following the Civil War, and all the problems with that. But in the New South, which flourished especially in such urban centers as Nashville and at such centers of higher learning as Vanderbilt and Peabody that were in Nashville. And so we see this huge change. The world that they're growing up in is very different than the one their parents grew up in and formed how they looked and understood things. And so we see that happening with them too. And the same with our kids. You know, how many of us have said, boy, we're glad there wasn't social media when we were growing up, right? You know, and all the problems and all that. And so, you know, we might get into it now and look at it and things like that. But, you know, the things that happen with that, even though we might see good in it, and I think there is, but there's also a lot of stuff that isn't good in it and what it does to people. And so we're glad. So our kids are growing up in the phone age, iPhone age, and Android and all that. And you know, I know it is with you guys, but I remember having to do a collect call to my parents once every 6 weeks, and it cost a whole lot more, right? When you did, or we had to write letters. What is that? You know. Things change. So just real, and so those things influence perspectives. These students lived in the interval between the two world wars, a period that witnessed a veritable explosion of scientific and technological achievements, and they were deeply impressed not only with the wonders of the modern world, but also with the general faith in progress. In other words, things are getting better. Hey, didn't you tell me how great it was when you guys got a refrigerator? And when you had indoor plumbing instead of the outhouse? We were sitting at one of our things downstairs, and they're telling me all this. Okay, taught the same thing and taught it differently. Well, those are decisions that people have to make. But anyhow, and so when we got a fridge and indoor plumbing, we didn't want to go back. We didn't think that was a good thing, right? And so all of a sudden, we have this general faith in progress. And maybe you have a car that works maybe better. I mean, you guys know all these things because you guys lived through a lot of this happening. And so that profoundly is affecting things. It is not surprising then that they sought to reconcile churches of Christ to the spirit of the modern age, but the old apocalyptic perspective of the 19th century constituted an obstacle to that reconciliation. Okay.
So I think the problem that these guys have, and I feel sorry for them because I see their struggle, is trying to make the church conform to, or make the world conform to the church, whichever way they're going at it.
Yeah.
And that's not our job. God will take care of that.
Uh-huh.
God understands the internet, and He understands
Yeah.
the outhouse.
Uh-huh.
He'll make the church fit the situation, and the people have to learn to live in that situation.
But we need to read the Bible to learn how God deals with situations.
Sure.
I'm in Numbers
Yeah. And so how do we process that? How do we deal with it? Because it's interesting how we got it all figured out. Why didn't they have it figured out?
Because they're trying to do something that humans are not able to do. Trying to reconcile the church to society. I'm sorry, that's not our job.
It's a different kingdom. And
We're
shame.
talking about two different worlds.
As Lipscomb would say, you know what? We've got to stop. Sorry because of the time. We're way past. So thank you. Thank you very much. Great discussion. This is exciting. And we will continue next week. And hopefully we'll have it solved by then and figured out.